Christopher Wiley joins me now. Mr. Wiley, welcome to Meet the Press, sir.
Cheers.
Let me start with this. Tell me how Cambridge Analytica came to be and what the company you thought you were a founding member of was going to do.
Sure. So in 2013, I joined a company called SCL Group, which is a UK-based military contractor, as director of research. And as part of that role, I was looking at how to take a lot of the techniques and projects that they were doing and port that onto a digital environment. And we got introduced to Steve Bannon, who, as we now know, was, later became the campaign manager to Donald Trump, and he was looking for a means of building his arsenal to fight a culture war. And so coming to a military contractor that does information operations was something that was quite appealing to him.
So what animated you about this project?
Well, I mean, originally when I was at SCL, I had a lot of really interesting projects to work on. Not all of them were as Orwellian or nefarious as what, later has been reported. Looking at, HIV/AIDS projects in Africa or health projects, and that was quite interesting to me. And more broadly, expanding into the United States was interesting because, it was a new country, a new culture, and that was quite interesting.
What did you think the contract was as you were creating Cambridge Analytica and Steve Bannon's involvement? Where did you think it was headed, say, at the start of 2014 before you left the company?
Sure. I mean, they didn't make a secret that, Robert Mercer or Steve Bannon was, fairly right-wing and had, very particular political views. But honestly, a lot of people who were working on the project thought that the research that we were doing would ultimately be applied to the commercial sector and in finance, given Robert Mercer's backgrounds in finance and integrating algorithms into his hedge fund, that a lot of the work that we would be doing actually had a lot of potential in that area.
Tell me about Robert Mercer. Many people don't know much about him. You said you have met him. How many times did you meet with him? Yeah. How often did you work with him?
So the Mercers were involved fairly early on, and it was less Robert Mercer and more Rebecca Mercer, his daughter, who managed the company early on, and then continued when it was being set up. Robert Mercer is interesting. He's clearly, he's unique in the sense that in a lot of projects that I've worked on in the past, donors are usually the person that you have to sort of condense and explain very slowly what it is that you're doing, right, because often they're not very technical. But Robert Mercer's background is in technology, and he has a PhD in that, and so he's rare in the sense that he's actually one of the smartest people in the room, when you are talking to him. But in terms of the actual sort of day-to-day management of the company, that fell to his daughter Rebecca.
Now, you talked about his intellect. Did he ever articulate what he was hoping you were creating?
I think that, ultimately he was just interested in the research that we were doing. Early on, it wasn't fully articulated as to what direction ultimately the company would take. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people recognized that the research that we were doing ultimately could prove valuable in various sectors. And when you look at a lot of technology companies early on, in Silicon Valley, for example, often they get investment simply to do research that would be multi-purposed, and you later find a market for it. It was quite clear that, I will say, it was quite clear early on that Steve Bannon absolutely wanted to use it for, Republican candidates, and the early projects that, we started to apply the research to were indeed alt-right candidates in the United States. And it was after, starting to meet some of the candidates and meet some of the clients that Robert Mercer and Steve Bannon, wanted to support, that a lot of people, including myself, started to feel quite uncomfortable with what we were doing.
Let me be clear. You left. Did you leave the company over politics? And is that what you would say, or did you leave it over their business practices?
There was lots of reasons. Alexander Nix was extremely difficult to work for. Steve Bannon is also extremely difficult to work for. I think that the company's internal culture became quite toxic. So in terms of an actual workplace environment, it was difficult to work in. And I think, ultimately, a lot of people, including myself, had to make a call, which is that, as the early founding team of a company, do we want to spend the next 10 years doing this? And for a lot of us, the answer was no.
So your goal was to leave the company and essentially start maybe a similar firm, but that focused on, say, center-left politics?
Yeah, I mean, I went on and became a consultant, and I do data science projects for progressive candidates and also other clients in the commercial sector. I have a particular, I think, as has been reported, I have a particular interest in fashion and the cultural sector, which often I find are very interrelated with politics. But I haven't worked for any Republican candidates since Cambridge Analytica.
All right, I want to go to something with Facebook announced this week when they announced some new protocols with advertising, but they also fessed up to even more data breach. I guess you wouldn't call it a data breach, but more data was released than even what you had indicated. You had indicated 50 million. Facebook says 87 million profiles were actually accessed. And then you tweeted this, Mr. Wiley. Yep, it was actually 87 million Facebook profiles. Could be more, to be honest. Media couldn't publish full number before because of legal threats. So when you originally gave your first interview on this, you knew it was 87 million, but you legally could only say 50 million?
Yeah, so when you're working with The Guardian and New York Times, for example, they are very thorough with making sure that anything that they publish is checked, double-checked, and if there's any question about a number, for example, how many records, they'll go with the most conservative estimate. So the New York Times and The Guardian chose 50 million because it was the most conservative estimate, and it was the thing that they had the most amount of evidence to show. When I met with the British authorities earlier in the year, one of the things that I said is that actually, the number is substantially more than that, from my recollection, and that also data was harvested in many more countries than the United States. But when you're working with the New York Times and The Guardian, they will make sure that anything that they publish is the most conservative estimate to play it safe, and that's what happened.
Is it possible do you believe the number 87 million is the high end, or do you think that's still possible that number is much higher?
I think that it could be higher. Absolutely.
Now, when Facebook contacted you, you were no longer with Cambridge Analytica. Why did they contact you and not Cambridge Analytica when it said to basically, can you please delete the 50 million profiles that you have access to?
Well, my understanding is that they contacted various people who were either at Cambridge Analytica or who had previously been at Cambridge Analytica who had access to the data. So it wasn't just me that they contacted. There were several other people that they also contacted and several other companies that they contacted. So the reason why I got, even though I was no longer at Cambridge Analytica, the reason why I got contacted was because they were going through anybody who either had access or may have had access at the time.
I want to play something that Sheryl Sandberg, the COO of Facebook, told my colleague Savannah Guthrie late last week. Here it is, and I want to get you to respond to it.
Sure.
We thought the data had been deleted. That's why.
But that doesn't mean you don't tell the users, hey, this was stolen from you.
Yes, you're right, and we should have done that. We should have done that as well.
Because it feels like Facebook was trying to get away with it.
I don't think that's true, but of course you're right, and we should have done that. So let's fast forward to now.
All right. So that's Sheryl Sandberg saying, yeah, they probably should have told users that their data had been taken. Were you the only person that had access to these 50 million, or how many other people had or still has access to all of these profiles?
I couldn't tell you how many. One of the things that I would say is that actually in Europe and in the UK in particular, it's actually a legal requirement to notify users if there is indeed any kind of breach of their data. So, one of the things that I would point out is that actually
you believe Facebook broke UK law?
What I'm saying is that there is a legal requirement in Europe to notify users if personal data has been breached, or if there's a substantial risk of a breach. In terms of how many people had access to the Facebook data or derivatives of that data, I couldn't tell you, because it was a lot of people. It wasn't just a few people.
When you say a lot, dozens? I mean, this was that easy to access, whether you were with Cambridge Analytica or another subsidiary, or could this be could this now these files be all over the world by now?
Well, part of the reason why I spoke out was so that this could be looked at, because I think that there is a genuine risk that this data has been accessed by quite a few people, and that it could be stored in various parts of the world, including Russia, given the fact that the professor who was managing the data harvesting process was going back and forward between the UK and to Russia. At the same time as he was working for Russian-funded projects on psychological profiling. So I couldn't tell you how many people had access to it. I mean, that's a question better put to Cambridge Analytica. But I do know that there were several people who had access to it.
Is it your understanding that Facebook could not even verify right now, if they wanted to, how many people had all this data, or could they?
Well, once data leaves your system, and once data leaves, your database, data is a fungible thing, sure, right? You can make as many copies as possible. So it isn't actually materially possible to verify if that data has been eliminated from the existence of the universe, because another copy could have been made. So it is, unfortunately, very difficult to verify. I know that Facebook is now starting to, take steps to rectify that and start to find out who had access to it and where it could have gone. But ultimately, it's not watertight to say that we can ensure that all the data is gone forever.
If Facebook can be faulted for anything as not being creative about how data could have been misused, if you were advising them right now, if Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg, instead of treating you as a pariah right now, said, okay, tell us how to fix this system since you so successfully used it, what would you tell them?
One of the comments that I'd actually make is that Facebook's really sort of knee-jerk reaction and sort of very sudden policy changes in terms of third-party data access, for example, and with Experian and Axiom and all that, or a lot of the sort of knee-jerk reactions in terms of changing the privacy policy isn't necessarily the best way forward. One of the things that I would say is that if you create an overly restrictive system in terms of data, you might actually encourage misuse more often than not. And you can see that in IT security and all kinds of places when, even just in your office, if you have an overly restrictive email policy and you can't download an attachment, you might start using your phone instead of your email, right? So I think one of the things that I would say to Facebook, first of all, is I'd love to meet. That would be great. I'd love to sit down in a mutually respectful setting and talk about the what happened and how to move forward. But the other thing that I would caution Facebook and indeed people who are saying delete Facebook or we can't have privacy and we can't have data is that we might, in a knee-jerk reaction, we might actually be creating more problems than we're solving. And so I think that we need to take a really sort of measured and tempered reaction to what happened and really think carefully about some of the unintended consequences of the policy changes that they're making.
If one of the senators that has to question Mark Zuckerberg this week asked you for some question ideas, what's one or two that jumps to your mind?
Why won't you come and attend a parliamentary session in the UK? I think the fact that Cambridge Analytica was based in the UK, the authorities that have jurisdiction over Cambridge Analytica are based in the UK. The inquiry that has done the most amount of work, actually, in investigating Cambridge Analytica is Damian Collins' inquiry into fake news, which is based here in the UK at Parliament. So why is it that, Mark Zuckerberg won't actually bother to come and attend a parliamentary inquiry here in the UK, as everyone else is? I think of anything that he should be asked, why isn't it that you're sitting down with the British Parliament?
A couple questions that people have questioned your credibility. First, the acting CEO of Cambridge Analytica said this: The source of allegations against the company is not a whistleblower or a founder of the company. Christopher Wiley was a part-time contractor who left in July 2014 and has no direct knowledge of our work or practices since that date. He was at the company for less than a year, after which he was made the subject of restraining undertakings to prevent his misuse of the company's intellectual property while attempting to set up his own rival firm. Let me ask this question.
Right.
Can you say definitively that this Facebook data was used by the Trump campaign?
So let me just unpack that statement first before I get to the Trump campaign. So I started working at SCL Group before Cambridge Analytica exists. So he's sort of using a bit of weaselly language here because it was the work that I was doing at SCL Group as research director that formed the basis of the intellectual property for Cambridge Analytica. If I was not the research director, if I didn't introduce the firm to data and to targeting, Cambridge Analytica would not exist, full stop. So let me just address that there. Secondly, in terms of this July date that he's referring to, that's when I handed in my notice to Alexander Nix. That's not necessarily when I stopped actually working. So they're playing with dates and they're playing with language. In terms of did Donald Trump use this data, I think that's a good question to ask Cambridge Analytica and the Trump campaign. What I do know is that Alexander Nix was meeting with Corey Lewandowski in the spring of 2015, which his lawyers have confirmed to me, before Trump had even announced that he was a candidate.
But in fairness,
So
you can't say definitively that the Trump campaign used this Facebook data.
No, I can't, but I haven't, I think that this is something, there is a substantial risk that this data was misused. And given what we know about the company, and what the lengths that they're willing to do for their clients, I think it is worth a serious investigation and to take this seriously. So no, I can't say, I didn't work on the Trump campaign, so of course I can't say one way or the other whether Trump used it or not. But we do know a lot of things about this company that I think a reasonable person knowing these things would want to ask some pretty tough questions about what happened to that data.
I know you've been contacted by British authorities. Have you been contacted by American authorities like Bob Mueller, the special counsel here that's investigating the Russian interference?
I have been contacted by American authorities, yes.
And are you cooperating?
Yeah, I plan to be. We're just setting out dates that I can actually go and sit down and meet with.
Is this both with Congress and Mr. Mueller, or just one part, or is it both entities that are doing investigations?
It's, as I understand it, and my lawyer is the one interfacing with them, but it is both congressional investigations and also law enforcement and the Department of Justice.
All right, Christopher Wiley, I appreciate you coming on and sharing your views. Thank you, sir.
Cheers. Thank you for having me.
Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and then click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.